Okay.
Hi, John.
Hello, how's it going?
Good. How are you?
Good, good.
Good. How's Noah?
Good.
And
Good.
Nuri?
She's giving him a bath right now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Now for Wednesday.
I'm on hold on.
For her.
How come the screen so
So
small?
if you want anything,
Yeah, man, hold. eight people
I don't know what's going on.
are this.
There we go. Okay. Okay. So we've got another 7 minutes or so till 7. Keep letting everybody in. Actually,
Sharon, it's Gail.
Hello, Gail. How are you?
Oh, hi, Charlie. I wanted Sharon Green, but hello to you too. Sharon Green?
oh, I've been muting everyone as they come in.
And we've been unmuting ourselves as we come in.
Okay, gotcha.
Charlie, this is a very special night for you and Sharon. I'm very excited for you guys.
Thank you. We take full credit. Any mistakes are his own.
That is the truth.
That sounds familiar.
We're up to 12 participants.
Excellent. Wait, so you can unmute yourself even when I click mute all?
I don't know. Try.
No, I think if you do it, then we can't unless you let us in.
Okay, I'm going to do an experiment. I'm going to try muting and see. Try to unmute yourselves.
We're not muted.
And okay. Can you unmute yourselves now?
I don't.
Yes.
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 Okay. Okay.
I'll mute it again.
No, you don't have to. We have a couple minutes till we start. I was just testing her. And more of my work is these Zoom calls. So I am trying to master the platform as best as I can.
Right.
I'm glad you put on your dress sweater.
Gosh, everybody got dressed up for the occasion.
I'm in.
Hi, how are you?
Oh, man.
Hi, everybody. It's so nice to see so many good friends. Jonathan, I take Tai Chi and yoga with your mother and dad. So
Oh, lovely.
and besides Hazak, that's our big connection too.
I have to say the community in Cherry Hill is just extraordinary.
It is, John. We're very lucky.
Yeah. It's really, I just don't know where else there's something akin to it. It's remarkable.
And I'm still getting yoga lessons by my regular JCC teacher online at 11 o'clock every morning.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
This is great.
Of course, we keep seeing the same faces over and over again.
Oh, my God. It's Phil.
Aren't you lucky? I was thinking of
We're a
putting
little
different
bit late.
face.
That's because we were having dinner with Scott and his family.
On Zoom.
So I felt badly. I said, I have to get off to go to John Goldstein. He said, what?
You still have 4 minutes on it. You're still good.
Yeah, we're still good.
Is that Cliff?
Hi, Judy Bender. Nice to see you.
Good to see everybody.
Yes, it is. Zelda, I have an email sent. Thank you. Sharon?
Yes? Which
Green.
one? Yes.
Green.
Yes.
I remembered what I forgot.
Okay.
Whipped cream.
What? Ice cream?
Whipped
Okay.
cream.
Staple around here. Now we get all our calcium.
Must be an inside joke.
No,
Last night, Sharon had called me that if I happened to be going to BJ's, would I pick it up?
Actually, it was today, Aunt.
No, it was yesterday. It was yesterday. You remembered what it was today.
That's true.
You're right.
That's true,
You're
Ivy.
right. But I
It's hard
remembered
to keep
what I
track of
wanted
what
to
day
get
it is.
yesterday, but I couldn't remember today. But when I
What
opened the
difference does it make?
I
Every day is
remember.
like
But
every.
one day is the same as the next, so what difference?
Absolutely.
It's been a weekend for 6 weeks now.
Oh, I thought it was Monday every day of the week.
Every day we know
Hi,
it's
Marcia.
Saturday.
My
Hi,
excitement is taking the
Marcia.
trash out.
Hi, Sharon. Hi, Minna. Hi,
Hey.
Hi,
Hi, everybody.
Marcia.
How did the kitchen come out, Andy?
Very nice. Lovely.
Hi,
Great.
Rob.
Sharon Green, how's mom doing during this time?
Thank God. She's
Right.
doing amazing.
Okay, send her my
That's
best.
good.
Yeah,
Amazing.
your mother is amazing.
So we got my mother for her birthday an iPad called a GrandPad.
Now you realize that's her 99th birthday.
And we set it up for her, and now she can see her grandchildren and great-grandchildren.
How wonderful.
Call her. It's been wonderful.
You're gonna have to limit how much time she's on the computer.
Give her my
Well,
love.
That's funny.
She's my good friend.
Good.
You know, Laverne told me she got it. In the beginning.
What is it?
You can hear you, Art.
Camera, you better be careful what you're saying, you guys. Hey, Selena, how you doing?
Tell me something about
How are you? Bill found the box I was looking for. It was in his trunk.
Hooray. I knew it wasn't here.
Fanatic.
That's great.
I didn't think so.
Hey, how are you?
Hi, Stephanie.
Hi, everybody. How are you?
Stephanie.
Stephanie.
wow.
Chuck is here. He's doing the dishes, everyone.
Oh, good.
Brag, brag.
Hey, Danny, good to see
I
you.
don't have many dishes.
Hi, Minna.
Hi.
Hi,
Nice to
Lynn.
see you guys.
I know.
This afternoon.
Yeah, it has to go.
I did that.
Hi, Maylene and Marty. How are you?
Hello.
Hi,
There
Sharon.
we are. Oh, good.
Hi, Danny.
Oh, there's Dan.
Hi.
Oh, hi, Danny.
Hi, Dan.
Hi, Dan.
Hi, how are you?
How are you?
Good. How's everyone?
Good.
Good. How are you?
Good.
Everything okay in Easton?
And Cliff.
Great. Very
Hi,
excited.
Minna.
Candy.
Hello.
Where'd she go? I'm here.
Oh, Joel's.
Hi.
What are you drinking?
Yeah.
Art and Jennifer are.
David.
Hello.
Hi, everybody.
All right.
Hello.
Hi, Paul.
For 7 o'clock.
Yep.
I'm going to give another few minutes. Now we should start at like 7:05.
Okay.
Okay.
Hey, Joel.
Hi.
Hi, how you doing?
Okay.
Oh, this is a slightly different crowd. I'm very excited. More new
A
faces.
few different faces, huh?
Oh, Susan.
Hi, everyone.
Jonathan, you don't need somebody else to
Janet,
curate
hi,
this for
Susan.
you, like certain
Hi,
members of our
guys.
clergy do?
What's that?
Stephanie,
Never
how's
mind.
the baby?
She's great. Thank you.
Good.
Are
Hi,
you in
Steph.
Florida, Stephanie?
No, we're in Philadelphia.
Ah, okay.
Oh, yeah, that's Stephanie. I can't get this thing.
You're on, Art.
Looking good.
Hey, Bookie, how are you?
There, good. How you doing?
Okay, it's good to see you.
No, I haven't seen Myrna.
I see Myrna all the time.
Hi, Myrna. There's Cliff. And
Hi, Cliff.
Marcia. Hi, Cliff and Marcia.
Hi, Art. Hi, Roberta.
Hi, Marcia.
Cliff, want to buy some Phillies tickets?
Look at that.
Oh, no. I have two tickets for Broadway.
All right.
Oh.
Take a pound of
those Phillies tickets.
They were off today. There was no game. If you look at the schedule, it was an open date. Today was an open date on the schedule.
Eleanor Stoffman.
Oh, God.
Eleanor Stoffman and up here. But every time I touch it, it disappears.
Art, we'll buy a half a pound of the Phillies tickets.
Sliced in. Sliced in.
It costs less than corned beef.
Ellie.
I don't think so.
A-N-O-R. Ellie. L-E-L-E-A N-O-R.
It's so funny when
There's Danny.
Oh, Frank is on.
Yes.
Hi, Chair.
Hey, John.
Danny, how are you? How's Nancy?
Good, Paul. Fine. How are you guys?
We're muddling along like everybody else.
Here's Mike.
Thank God for Zoom.
Oh, your puppy. Hello, your puppy.
And Netflix.
Yes.
Our boy.
But Netflix, you don't get to see your friends.
That's true.
It's true.
We watch it so much, we think they are our friends.
You're probably watching too much.
We're on a first-name basis with actors in Iceland, in Finland.
And you call them all by their first name. They were friends.
Okay, so I am going
Got
to
it?
everyone.
Starting?
And yeah, we're going to get started. And as new people join, I will pause to just admit them into the room. Thank you so much, everybody. It's such a pleasure for me to do this with TBS. I grew up in this community. I have had the good fortune to work in a variety of ways with many members of the congregation, both in Israel and New York, with Chazak last year in New York. And I led a trip to Israel for the parents of young families with Rabbi Peltz. And at the end of that trip, I was saying how grateful it was and how meaningful it was to do a trip with my home community that I grew up in. And Rabbi Peltz stopped me and he said, it's not just your childhood community, it is always your community. And so anyone who says you can't go home again has never been to TBS in Cherry Hill. So my name is Jonathan Goldstein. I am the son of Charles and Sharon. And I grew up in Cherry Hill. I went to Kelman Academy and then to Akiba as well as Camp Ramah. And then I went to Columbia for undergrad where I studied history. I did a semester at the Intercollegiate Center for Classical Studies in Rome. And then afterwards, I did a short stint in finance before making Aliyah, moving to Israel, and doing a master's degree in Land of Israel Studies and Archeology at Bar Ilan. And in Israel, it's just a hop, skip, and a jump from archaeology to tourism. So I also did the Ministry of Tourism's tour guiding course. And I have spent most of my professional life visiting sites and explaining sites rather than actually digging them. So this lecture is going to be an introduction to biblical archaeology. It is going to be a very broad macro view, and it's going to go through the history of the field, some of the development of methodology, and we'll also get a microcosm of the history of the land of Israel for the past 200 years as we're going through it. So now I'm going to share my screen with you. Okay. Sorry, I have been learning how to do these virtual experiences as I go. Zoom is really wonderful, but there is a learning curve. Excellent. So I'm actually doing this with two different computers, so I can have my notes on one side and you can see the full screen on the other. So starting with the etymology of archaeology, archeos from the Greek means ancient, and logos meaning study of or word. And archaeology is a relatively recent scientific field. However, veneration of the past is nothing new. What we're looking at right here is Ma'arat HaMachpelah, the cave of Machpelah, otherwise known as the cave of the matriarchs and the patriarchs. This is in Hebron, and it was built 2,000 years ago by Herod the Great, the same individual who built Masada, who rebuilt the Second Temple, including the Western Wall. He built Caesarea and created an almost entirely artificial port. And he is a critical figure in the building of the country, the greatest builder the country knew until the modern era. He also has a questionable lineage. He's criticized heavily about how Jewish he is because his grandfather was forcibly converted by the Maccabees. So when pilgrims, Jewish pilgrims from all over the world are coming to Jerusalem for the 3 pilgrimage holidays on Passover, on Sukkot or Tabernacles, on Shavuot or Pentecost, he wants them to stop and remember that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, and Leah, they also were important Jewish figures who did not come from a storied Jewish lineage because they were the first ones. And so he too is sort of supporting his own claim to the leadership of the Jewish community. A few hundred years later, we have the newborn religion of Christianity, and Constantine's mother in around the year 325 CE. So when I say CE, it's the same as AD, but it's to secularize the date. So we're using the Christian calendar, but we're using it in a secular way. So we say the Common Era. Saint Helena will lay the groundwork for Christian pilgrimage to the Holy Land, as well as relics, to give a framework for the new religion to be able to embark in meaningful spiritual enterprises. So she is going to come to the land of Israel, identify important sites from events that took place in the New Testament. On the right-hand side, we have a piece of the true cross that is from the imperial treasury in Vienna, from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And on the left-hand side, this is a statue of her holding the true cross in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, the holiest site in Christianity, because that church is built over the site of the crucifixion, but more importantly in Christianity, the site of Jesus' tomb, which is where the resurrection happened. And without the resurrection, there is no Christianity. And today, in the modern state of Israel going forward, it's incredibly significant for the cultural heritage of a Jewish country, as well as embracing national glory. And particularly for Israel, for so much of its history, it's had to create arguments as to why it has the right to exist. Archaeology is hard archaeological proof of the Jewish connection historically to the land of Israel. And so our first couple of sites, this is a reference to cultural heritage. On the left-hand side, we have the Gezer calendar that dates to the 10th century BCE, and it was found in an archaeological mound called Gezer on the road between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. And this, on the left-hand side, is some of the earliest use of the Hebrew language that we yet know of. This was excavated, and you'll notice that the letters are completely different from the letters that we know today. Hebrew has never had its own alphabet. In antiquity, they used the Phoenician alphabet, which was the dominant language of the region, up until about the year 500 BCE, when they will take on the alphabet of a new dominant language of the region of the Aramaic alphabet. So today, Hebrew uses the Aramaic alphabet. So we have the earliest use of the Hebrew language, and on the right-hand side, this piece, which uses the same letters, the same Phoenician script, because it dates to the 9th century BCE, you can see the area that's highlighted in white. That's for our purposes. That's not how it was found. But that says Ben David. This was a stela, or a stone monument with an inscription on it, that was found in the site of Tel Dan, on the northern border of Israel, today just on the Lebanese border. And it says Ben David. It is a reference to a king of Judah that was actually defeated in battle, the descendant of David. And this is the earliest known usage of the name of David. So before this was found, David could have been an Arthurian legend. If you take him out of the biblical context and you hold to divine truth for a moment, we don't know. But now we have hard archaeological evidence that dates to around 150 years after he would have reigned in Jerusalem. So it's a pretty good argument for the existence of King David. So just a fun trivia question, and you can put it in the chat or just something to think about. Where was the Gezer calendar? Where is it on display today? And so I put a bunch of different world-class museums that all have their fair share of biblical artifacts. And as you're thinking about it, I'll go through some of the answers. And in about a minute, I'll reveal the answer and we can see who got it right. So the Gezer calendar was excavated by a British archaeologist. It was excavated in the land of Israel. So either the Israel Museum or the Land of Israel Museum could be candidates. It was excavated in the first decade of the 20th century when the Ottomans were still ruling. And somehow the Vatican Museum just seems to get their hands on just about everything. But it is on display today in the Istanbul Archaeological Museums. So moving forward, we have National Glory. This is a model of Second Temple Jerusalem at the height of ancient Judea, just before the Jewish rebellion against Rome in the year 70. And we can go and see that Jerusalem was one of the great cities on earth at the time. Rome was by far and away the greatest Mediterranean city around the year zero. But Jerusalem would have been on par with the cities of Alexandria, of Athens, of Antioch. It would have been right on that second tier, just behind Rome. And through archaeology, we've been able to identify that this plaza, the Temple Mount, the plaza of which the western wall is the western wall of the plaza, the temple complex, is the largest single religious center found from the Roman Empire. Because in Rome, you have hundreds of temples to hundreds of gods, but in Jerusalem, you have one temple to one God, and the people, all of the people's resources went into creating a single magnificent space. And the last one, right to exist, the Dead Sea Scrolls, which date from the time of the Maccabees through to the Great Rebellion against the Romans. The finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls is hard archaeological proof of two things. One, the continuity of scripture. Found almost every single book of the Tanakh, of the Hebrew Bible, represented among the Dead Sea Scrolls. And almost the entire scroll of Isaiah was excavated, virtually word for word, the same as it is today. The second thing that this is hard archaeological proof of is thriving Jewish life in the land of Israel 2,000 years ago. So for Israel's imagery, on its stamps, on its coins, as we can see in front of us, there's an archaeological park at the Knesset, or Israel's parliament, in Jerusalem. Right here, this is the 5 shekel coin, and on the back of it, you can see what looks like an Ionic column. And Ionic columns are Greek. However, on the right-hand side, you can see this is the head of a proto-Ionic column. This predates Ionic columns in Greece. We see them already in the land of Israel, and we see them in sites that are associated with royalty. So we find them in Jerusalem during the Israelite period, but also even earlier, we find them in Canaanite palaces. So it seems as though this was actually originated, as far as we know, in the land of Israel, and then would later influence Greek culture and not the other way around. So now I want to go to the dawn of biblical archaeology, and this is just a fun tidbit going to the dating of the earth. This is something that up until the Enlightenment, the Bible was our sole source for trying to figure out how the age of the earth. The Jewish year that we use today comes from a figure who is mentioned several times in the Mishnah. If you've been to Israel, you may have gone to a site called Tzipori or Sepphoris. The site has tremendous mosaics from 1800 years ago. That is where he lived. It's also where the Mishnah was codified in the year 200 CE. And Rabbi Yossi ben Halafta is the one who dated creation to October 7th, 3761 BCE, or the year 5780 today. This was not generally accepted immediately. In fact, the dating we don't really see using the Jewish year until the Middle Ages. And during the Middle Ages, rabbis would have discussions about when creation actually was, because there are some areas in the book of Genesis where we don't have the specific datings. So there's a lot of different possibilities to get to the exact year. But this is the year, it's the iconic year that we use today. An Archbishop of Dublin in the 1600s he's sort of at this transitional moment between the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. And he comes up with 6 p.m., October 22nd, 4004 BCE. He's using the King James Bible, which was new at the time. And the reason that I have this here is because up until the Enlightenment, our questions were primarily done through a biblical framework. But the Enlightenment is when the dating of the earth will be taken out of the Bible and brought into science. And so slowly, the dating starts to expand until with Marie Curie, we get radioactivity, and then we can start to really get the dates into the billions and much more accurate. But this question mark of going outside of the Bible leads to a new version of appreciation for the Bible. And assuming for a moment it is not divine truth, scholars start to parse it out and to see what if it's not divinely written? And what emerges is known as the source theory, the identifying two different names for God that will repeat themselves throughout the narrative, particularly in Genesis. You have the Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, or Jehovah or Yahweh, and then you have Elohim. And so scholars start to parse this out and see two different literary styles and two different narratives that they argue was fused together by a single editor. And then things like Leviticus, which is mostly a how-to guide for priestly ritual, a separate source from the Kohanim, and then the most scandalous portion, I would argue, is Deuteronomy. The Deuteronomic history argues that King Josiah, who in the book of Kings is celebrated as the greatest king since King David, his forefather, but it talks about how he is cleaning out the temple in Jerusalem, finds a book, and there's an argument that that book was from Deuteronomy, including Joshua, Judges, Samuel 1 and 2, Kings 1 and 2, and that he's trying to glorify his own line, and this is why we have the Davidic line as ruling forever. And that it also centralizes religious worship in Jerusalem. So as a reaction to the source theory and also the opening up of Ottoman Palestine in the 19th century, we have the forefather, I would argue, of biblical archaeology, but we'll call him the father of biblical geography because he does not actually dig. This is Edward Robinson. He is a devout Protestant who comes in 1838, shortly after Napoleon, who ravaged much of Egypt, as well as Ottoman Palestine in 1799. Afterwards, a ruler in Egypt, well, really a governor under the Ottomans, whose name is Muhammad Ali, not the Muhammad Ali that's Cassius Clay and the great boxer, but Muhammad Ali, if you've been to Cairo, there's a Muhammad Ali Mosque. And he is the governor who's responsible for rebuilding Egypt after Napoleon does a tremendous amount of destruction. He looks westward, he looks towards Europe to modernize his army, and he becomes so powerful that he marches against the Ottomans and he rebels against them. So in the 1830s, he has taken over Ottoman Palestine, and he's a westward looking ruler. So it's a perfect time for Edward Robinson to come and start exploring. Since the Crusades in 1291, and if you've seen the History Channel series Nightfall, the fall of Acre in 1291 is depicted in the pilot episode of that TV show. That plays a lot with history, but it's fun to see a depiction of this historical event. But since 1291, the Ottomans were not too favorable of having Christians come into the Holy Land. But the country is starting to open up. But he's really critical because he goes around the country, identifies 200 sites based on biblical geography, as well as the names that have been preserved in Arabic. So he goes around and he sees Arabic villages that sound like biblical sites in locations where they make sense. He correctly identifies 200 sites. And most importantly, he identifies Robinson's Arch. So the picture on the right is Robinson's Arch. What is Robinson's Arch? If you have had relatives who have been bar or bat mitzvahed in an egalitarian service at the Western Wall, then you have been to Robinson's Arch. This is what it looks like before the excavations in the 1980s. You can see ground level is just beneath these stones that are jutting off the wall. Can everybody see my cursor? So there are the stones, that's Robinson's Arch. And this is what ground level used to be. And now this is what it looks like today. So Robinson's Arch is up here. From there down to ground level, this is the Roman street. It's about 60 feet or so. And in the distance, we can see the hill that has been completely cleared out and is being held up. So Robinson did not have the benefit of knowing what lay beneath his feet. And this is a virtual reality rendition of what it would have looked like. So this is why it's called Arch, because you can see it would have been a massive land bridge that was supported by an arch, and it would have been one of the entrances onto the Temple Mount. And he's the first guy who identifies it as part of Herod's temple complex. And this whole wall here is all the Western Wall. So on top, we have a rendition of what it would have looked like 2,000 years ago. This is Robinson's Arch that I'm circling with the cursor. And the Western Wall originally is the whole thing, which is about 500 meters or 5 football fields. And the plaza today is pretty much this area, just a small fraction, maybe an eighth of the entire length of the wall. And so lower down, we can see this is the Western Wall Plaza, but the Western Wall itself continues. Robinson's Arch is right around here, just a few stones jutting out. And if you have gone into the Western Wall tunnels, you can go the length of the wall underground. And here, this is where we have Charles Warren, who has the best mustache of any of the excavators. He's coming to the country in the 1860s, and he's kind of like an Indiana Jones figure. He spent most of his time in the British Army, and as a young man, he serves in Gibraltar, which to this day is still British. And he does a survey of Gibraltar, and he makes a scale map of Gibraltar, including every building and every road on Gibraltar. And this can still be visited today in Gibraltar. And after he finishes his service in Gibraltar, he is appointed to lead the Palestine Exploration Fund. Queen Victoria has created this by royal charter, and it's just after the Crimean War. The Crimean War in the 1850s, Russia is expanding down towards the Black Sea. The Ottomans are retreating, and the French and the English will come to the aid of the Ottomans. At the end of the Crimean War, the Ottomans make concessions to the Western powers for their aid. And so more and more, the country is opening up, and Charles Warren is going to come, and this is his survey of the Temple Mount at the time. And the dark, if you see the cursor on the left-hand side, the dark areas are all underground and part of the Western Wall tunnels today. So he also does not totally understand archaeology as we understand it today, and he doesn't know how much of ancient cities are still there. But in Jerusalem, he is okay with digging, not to excavate exactly, but to explore hollow areas. And he does understand that those hollow areas are from earlier times. So on the right-hand side, we have Charles Warren going into the Western Wall tunnels before they were a tourist attraction by candlelight and exploring, and he's discovering an original stone here from the Western Wall from 2,000 years ago that Herod the Great had built. And this has a completely smooth facade and a border going around. That was his trademark. Massive, massive stones that would have weighed many tons. The largest stone of the Western Wall is the second largest stone known in ancient architecture, and it weighs 570 tons, or the weight of 8 modern tanks. But his biggest discovery is known today as Warren's Shaft. We are looking straight down a vertical shaft of 37 feet underground in the city of David. And so in the center of this image, you see where it says vertical shaft? We're up here and we're looking down and we are seeing a shaft that is near the water source of Jerusalem. So why do we care about this? We care about this because it says in the Bible that King David found Jerusalem so well fortified, he wanted to try and conquer it through alternative means. So he sends troops through the water system. So we don't know how exactly, but somehow the theory is that they got into the water system from outside the city walls and then came through the water system, and Charles Warren suggested up Warren's Shaft and was able to get inside the city that way to conquer the city from the inside out, not so different from the Trojan horse story. So this is a theory that has been debated ever since, to be able to find out how King David conquered Jerusalem and was able to make it the capital of the Jewish people 3,000 years ago. Warren had a fascinating history afterwards. Just really quickly, his colleague, Edward Henry Palmer, will take over the Palestine Exploration Fund after Warren returns to England. Palmer is in the Sinai. He is excavating and exploring the wilderness of the Exodus, and he disappears. So Charles Warren is assigned to go and see what happened to Palmer. He finds the remains of Palmer and his crew. He then brings the murderers to justice, and when he gets back home, he is made the head of the police force. He's made the commissioner of the police force in London. And he will be the commissioner during the tragedy of Jack the Ripper. And he was heavily criticized for his role with Jack the Ripper. And he later on also goes on to serve in the Boer War. I am. So after Charles Warren, we have Flinders Petrie, who is considered the father of modern archaeology because he's the first guy who understands that there is really so much to be found underground in terms of artifacts. He is going to make it a science. And he goes back to geology and the law of original horizontality, which just really briefly, we have number one is any cut of earth, and the geology in number two has horizontal layers. And in 2B, we can see that depending on what happens, the tectonic plate shifting, the layers may shift, but they will still be the same in relation to each other. And so utilizing that, we carry it over to archaeology. And this is a tell. A tell is an archaeological mound. On the bottom, we have the original city. And then in a place like the ancient Near East, conquerors come, destroy it, then they level it off, rebuild a city on top. That gets destroyed, it gets leveled off, another city is built on top, and then here we are up on top of the hill, and we are the archaeologists. So we're gonna go by strata, and the context through which we find different artifacts are going to be key in terms of understanding. Now, Petrie will spend most of his time in Egypt, and he discovers the Merneptah stela in Thebes in Egypt, which is very important for our purposes because this area down here that is highlighted, that is highlighted for our purposes. That is the oldest use of the name Israel that we have found outside of the Bible. And this is from a pharaoh called Merneptah around 1200 BCE, who could conceivably be the pharaoh of the Exodus. His father was Ramses II. So Ramses II is usually thought to be the pharaoh of the Exodus. He is the son. He lives for a brief time, but what we do know is that he's the first person that we know thus far who has used the name Israel outside of the Bible. Let's skip that. And Petrie's, one of his biggest legacies is that he will train Howard Carter, who is going to be the archaeologist who excavates King Tut's tomb. Petrie was a eugenicist himself, and he believed that he represented the perfect, brilliant British mind, and he wanted it to be studied for posterity. So in his will, he had retired in Jerusalem, and he's buried in a Protestant cemetery on Mount Zion, just outside the Old City. This is his grave on the left-hand side. But he willed his head to be sent to the Royal College of Surgeons to be studied in London. This was in 1942. So London had more important things on their mind than to study Petrie's head. Slowly the label had fallen off, and it was not discovered until an Israeli archaeologist named Shimon Gibson goes to London trying to find out what happened to Petrie's head, and in 1989 is able to identify Petrie's head, or at least he thinks he does. So next we have the discoverer of the Gezer calendar. This is R.A. Stewart McAllister. He goes out there and he is not using Petrie's methods, which believe that you should painstakingly go through everything that is in the area where you're excavating to have as much context about your find as possible. And so he just goes and he cuts 10 meter by 10 meter wide trenches, massive trenches, digs everything through more like a treasure hunter than an archaeologist, and he dumps all the earth in his previous trench. So he is going to make the archaeology in Gezer much less valuable because he moves things around so much. So archaeologists do continue to go there, but it's a bit of a mess and not nearly as valuable when he finds. However, the Gezer calendar is still considered to be the oldest use of the Hebrew language. So that's the most important find that came out of that. And Gezer, on the road between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, has always been the site of a lot of conflict, including in Israel's War of Independence. Tel Gezer is right next to a kibbutz with the same name. And that was the headquarters of the Israeli army in a major battle in 1948 for a fortress called Latrun. So the last point on Latrun is that if you have seen the movie Cast a Giant Shadow, you have seen Kirk Douglas fight over Latrun. Today, Latrun is the museum for the armored brigades. It's both a memorial and a museum for the armored brigades and has an example of every tank that has ever been used in the Israeli army since 1948 to today. And the last thing that he did that's really cool is if you have gone to the Dead Sea from Jerusalem, You may have seen these marks. There's no good place to stop on the side of the road there, but the highway's at the bottom. That's the highway on the way to the Dead Sea. And these black marks, as well as this red line, are water levels of the Dead Sea going back to the dawn of the 20th century. Members of the Palestine Exploration Fund marked the water level. Today, the Dead Sea is behind the photographer. So this highway was paved in the 1970s, and the water level now is about 150 feet lower than it was at the dawn of the 20th century as the Dead Sea recedes remarkably quickly. So I want to skip ahead just a bit for time's sake and share the story of a true treasure hunter, Captain Montague Brownlow Parker. He goes out to find the Ark of the Covenant, and he's digging through the same caves that Charles Warren was exploring. And as he's going through these tunnels, he's trying to find the Ark of the Covenant, not because he is religious, but because he believes it will have tremendous value on the international art market. He thinks he can get $200 million for the Ark of the Covenant. He's digging in 1911. This is just after the Young Turks Revolution in Constantinople. So the Sultan has been overthrown. They're trying to modernize the government in the Ottoman Empire. However, we see through Monty Parker's story that it was no better. He basically bribes any official he can get access to and starts digging on the Temple Mount itself, which was totally foreboding. The site of Solomon's temple, the site today of the Dome of the Rock, so the holiest site in Judaism, the third holiest site in Islam. It is way too sensitive to excavate. And he is digging there, and he is seen, he's basically chased out of the country. And this is a headline. This is the best version I could find, but this is from the New York Times in 1911. The headline says, "Have Englishmen found the Ark of the Covenant?" Talking about Monty Parker's story. He did not, but the rumor was so powerful, he had to flee and could never return. And now, oh, why isn't this loading? Why? So what should be on the screen right here is Kathleen Kenyon, the grand dame of archaeology, and arguably the greatest archaeologist of the 20th century. If you want a job done right, have a woman do it. Kathleen Kenyon is the one who comes in and really professionalizes the field. She's utterly meticulous in her excavations and believe that every bit of dirt, every piece of pottery is absolutely critical. And she spends most of her time in Jericho. And she has two monumental finds that would totally alter our understanding of the biblical world. One, she has the benefit of carbon dating. Carbon dating comes following advances that were made during World War II. So she brings samples from this tower that we see and can have it dated. It goes back to 8,000 BCE, or 10,000 years ago, making this the oldest continuously inhabited city on Earth. The other thing that she finds is that it's the oldest continuously inhabited city on Earth, but that's relatively continuously, because Jericho in the Bible is the first site that Joshua's army is going to conquer. After the death of Moses, when Joshua will lead the Israelites into the promised land, he will take his army, go around the walls of Jericho 7 times, blow the ram's horn, the shofar, and the walls will come tumbling down. However, we have a problem in the dating that it was uninhabited from 1550 BCE, before the conquest could have happened, through until the 10th century BCE, until after. So that window is when we date Joshua's conquest. So it has raised some big questions about Joshua's conquests. And there's a new theory as to what that tower was used for.
Now, using computer technology, Israeli archaeologists are saying it was built to mark the summer solstice and as a symbol that would entice people to abandon their nomad ways and settle down. Ran Barkai of Tel Aviv University showed that when the tower was built, the nearby mountains cast a shadow on it as the sun set on the longest day of the year. The shadow fell exactly on the structure and then spread out to cover the entire village. According to Barkai, this tower took a lot of effort to build and showed that leaders were able to exploit primeval fears and persuade them to make it. Barkai may be right. After all, although 11,000 years have passed, mankind still engages in megalithic buildings and erects monuments to influence public opinion and enhance their standing.
So previously, they figured that the tower was part of a fortification, part of the defense of the city walls. It wasn't totally clear. This is a very, very new theory. And I think it also clarifies that archaeology is piecing together a puzzle, a 1,000-piece puzzle where we only have 200 pieces. So our understanding of different sites is always evolving and it's always changing. And the last archaeologist I wanted to talk about was Yigal Yadin, who was Israel's national archaeologist. He was born in Ottoman Palestine just months before the British conquered the country in World War I. He will then change his name along with the name of the country. When Israel is born, he changes his name from Yigal Suknik to Yigal Yadin. And he will become the second chief of staff of the IDF, of the Israel Defense Forces, in 1949 at the tail end of Israel's War of Independence. And then afterwards, he follows in his father's footsteps into archaeology. And his father had the good fortune to have access to the newly found Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls were actually found during Israel's War of Independence in December of 1947. In an area that would fall to the Jordanians and was controlled by Jordan from 1949 until 1967. But Israel immediately recognized the importance of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and a lot of the Dead Sea Scrolls would wind up on international antiquities markets, including black markets, and Israel would buy them up. And today, Jerusalem has the vast majority of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Israel Museum, because again, they are seen as critical to Israel when Israel is trying to defend itself as its right to exist. Hard archaeological evidence of active Jewish life 2,000 years ago in the country. Yigal Yadin would work with the Dead Sea Scrolls. He would also find many of the Bar Kokhba letters. Bar Kokhba was a William Wallace type figure. He was a Jewish general in the Second Rebellion against the Romans that we have very little information about in the Talmud or in Roman writings, but we have a ton of archaeology thanks to Yigal Yadin. And he also excavated Masada, and in Hatzor he finds a gate. Now this city gate, Hatzor, by the way, was the greatest Canaanite city during Joshua's conquest in 1200 BCE. And he finds a gate where the entrance is from the top of the picture, walking through. On either side are the foundations of 2 towers that would have flanked the gate, and then 3 chambers on either side. Now, Yadin notes this, and he notes the similarity of a gate in Gezer. So Gezer, which was excavated by McAllister, McAllister dates this to the Maccabees, this area. So we can see the entrance to the gate is over here. This is a piece of the foundation of the tower. And then we have 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So very similar layouts. If you are an architect putting a floor plan together, they're very similar, and also very similar to a gate in Megiddo. Now Megiddo has the least of the gate remaining. So the gate would have been entered from up here, and you have just the left-hand side with 2 of the chambers excavated, 1 not yet, and the right-hand side is not there. And in the book of Kings, it says specifically that Solomon fortified 3 cities in his empire: Hatzor, Gezer, and Megiddo. And Yadin dates these 3 gates to the 10th century BCE, exactly when we date Solomon. So is this hard archaeological proof for King Solomon and his role as described in the Bible? And that's the big question in archaeology today. New archaeologists have been going back and saying, you know, it's hard to argue that this is 10th century BC. It seems like it's later, and it's more consistent with a later king. So the question becomes, what role does the Bible have in archaeology? Is the Bible the source, and we're trying to understand the stories and the finds in terms of the biblical narrative? Or is the Bible a source, and we go back and we use scientific methods to try and piece together what these sites have to tell us, but not jump the gun to a conclusion? So right now, there are some that argue these are Solomonic gates, and there are some that say they are the same architect and they were done at the same time, but not necessarily Solomonic gates. And that is the fundamental question Israeli archaeologists have today, the role of the Bible and how we are supposed to interpret the archaeology on their own merits or within the context that the Bible lays out. And with that, I'm going to stop and take questions. So let me try to unmute. I'm sorry that, wait, stop sharing. Trying to see, I'm going to stop sharing. I think that is why I'm having trouble. Pause recording. Participants. Hi. Unmute. Okay. Sorry about that.
Muted, everybody.
Everyone's unmuted now. Actually, maybe I'll mute everybody, and if you have a
You
question.
should mute everyone.
Mute everyone and raise your hand.
That's what
Okay. Well, raise your hand.
And
The current environment will take 6 months to get the garage figured out.
I was able
Oh, I should tell her that.
to unmute everybody. Why can't I mute everybody?
mute.
Anyone have a question?
John?
Hi. All right. I unmuted everybody, and I can't seem to mute everyone again.
Uh-oh.
And? Mute ourselves.
Ask your question.
Well,
people can mute themselves.
Everyone can mute themselves.
Oh yeah. Can we have? I'm sorry. How about we do it that way?
Just shut up.
John?
Somebody's asking a question.
I couldn't hear. Everybody can mute themselves.
It's
No, why is it not
it's
working?
a Q&A link. I'm going to go into chat.
Raise hand, there it is.
There is no raise hand in this
Your
particular
computer
setup.
easier to use. Windows will read and scan this list automatically.
Okay, I see Vivian's hand.
Spacebar to select the highlighted option.
John,
Oh, yes.
what
No,
is
there's
the
no
name
answer. Yes,
of
there
the
is.
grand
You want to ask a
dame
question?
of archaeology with Jericho? What was her name?
Her name is Kathleen Kenyon.
Kathleen
Opinion.
Kenyon. Yes, I don't know why that slide didn't load. I haven't had problems with it in other presentations that I've done. Yeah, so she excavated in Jericho, and she also excavated in Jerusalem, actually when in parts of Jerusalem that were under Jordanian control before 1967.
Thank you.
Yeah, she's most active in the 50s and 60s.
50s and 60s, okay.
Mhm.
Thank you.
And she really laid the groundwork for, or she laid the standard for how archaeologists should operate
Biography of her.
excavations.
Thank you.
Excellent. Any other questions? I do not know why I'm clicking on mute all and it's not.
Hello, I have a question.
Yes.
What about Albright?
Ah, excellent. Yeah. So I didn't mention Albright just because I wanted to have like an evolution of the field with like some fun stories. Albright was the first to recognize the importance of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So Albright was British, and he also was incredibly important in biblical archaeology and in Israel's archaeology, and Institute in Jerusalem today. And yeah, I would argue his biggest contribution.
No, still there. Nancy.
Nancy does not put audio on. Normally Marshall doesn't.
Any other questions?
Yeah, what is it?
I have a question.
Oh, yeah.
How could that be the first Hebrew that was found? It seems to be after the time when they say the Mount Sinai occurred.
Oh, that's a great question. And so the answer to that is specifically archaeological. We haven't found anything archaeologically of Mount Sinai.
Okay.
And yeah, so that is not to suggest that this is the start of the Hebrew language, just the oldest that we have found outside of the Bible.
Okay, thank you, John.
Sure.
What's that?
What is the general thought on how long it took to set up the different fortifications? How many years it took?
Oh, that's a great question.
What you thinking, Tom?
That's really interesting. So in Jericho, they estimate that it took 100 workers about 4 months to build that tower that was about 25 feet tall. And it was so early that they were using pretty basic tools. So the stones are not cut at all. Stones were all found and with a very primitive kind of a mortar put together. And then you go to something like the extreme on the other end, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, where Herod was going to build that massive temple complex. That would have been an ongoing project for decades. Not just
I have to listen to something so I can say I heard something.
He made a link.
Is a guide there?
What was your question? What?
She was answering that.
Charlie,
I know.
Any other questions?
They're signing off.
Yes.
They're signing off.
52.
Sorry. Yeah, so one of the most recent finds that's really sensational
Because I was going to
is an archaeologist named
some of the old stuff, which I haven't done.
She found a large stone structure in Jerusalem to the 10th century BCE, and she has identified it as King David's palace. It makes sense time-wise. It does seem to be a monumental structure, and there's a lot of arguments saying you can't make the leap to say King David's palace without some sort of an inscription, something more specific. However, it certainly could be. Yeah. Excellent. Oh, is there another hand? LH?
How do you do that? Raise my hand.
John, are you able to stop the share screen?
No.
Yes. That, let me see.
Ah, there you go.
Okay.
That's better.
Oh, and then it says start a new, okay. So now I see, oh, I see, that's probably why. So now I think I muted everybody. So now, okay. If you have a question,
Can I?
Oh, yeah.
Are you going to give another lecture on this same subject? It was very good.
Oh, thank you. So I would be happy to. This is actually the introductory lecture to an 8-part course where the following ones are all sites. So like we would go to the old city of Jaffa and explore what's there today, what was found, and a little bit about the modern history. And then after that, we go to Megiddo, which is the namesake of Armageddon. And then we do a bunch in Jerusalem, one for the old city of Jerusalem, and then also the city of David right outside of the old city, to do a little bit of like weaving through, doing the archaeological finds, the story of the sites themselves, the geography and things like that. So I would be happy to.
I have a question. I don't know how to do this.
Oh, hi.
I have a question. Am I unmuted?
Yeah, you're muted.
Okay. So you talked about carbon dating, and have they made any headway, the archaeologists, along with like geophysicists, where they can measure the dates of, like they've measured moon rock dating. Can they do that with some of the stones from the different periods? Have you worked with the geophysicists on that to try to identify the age of some of these rocks?
That's really interesting. So with carbon dating, generally you don't date the rock themselves. You date things that are near the rocks, which is why it's a little bit less precise. So if you have stone structure, the carbon dating, you would try to find something with carbon in it nearby. So usually like a bone, maybe a seed or something like that, that seems to have been buried at that site around the time that it was built. So take that to a lab, test it, and the carbon dating is testing the half-life of carbon. This is getting really wonky. So basically, every 5,000 years or so, the amount of carbon that is left in an object that had carbon in it will decay 50%. And so if you picture going from one wall in a room to another wall, you can keep walking halfway and you'll never get all the way there. So there's always a little bit of carbon left to test. And you can go back with carbon dating easily 70,000 years. So carbon dating doesn't do the rock itself. I don't know if there's work with geophysicists to try and do that. I think the problem with the rock itself is that the rock would have existed before it was utilized for the structure that was found.
Right.
And so I think that would be, but it would be really interesting. I'm going to look into that and to see if there is work going forward on that front.
Thank you.
Sure. Hello.
John, do you have any thoughts about how Herod had those huge multi-ton blocks moved?
It does seem as though they had very sophisticated systems of equipment utilizing pulleys and logs and things like that. However, the largest stones, like that 570-ton stone that I mentioned, was not on the ground level. It's not like he cut that out of bedrock and left it there. It's raised up. And so that has sort of baffled archaeologists as to how that would have been conceivable. They have messed around with building replicas of equipment that would have been able to lift more of like the average stones, which are also many, many tons. In fact, just near Robinson's Arch, there's another stone that it's not quite as large as the 570-ton one, but it's about 400 tons. And it's just inconceivable that 2,000 years ago, pre-industry, they were able to raise it. And it's significantly high up. It's like, I don't know, it's at least 20 feet up or so.
I think God did it. John, on behalf of Chazak, I want to thank you for your presentation.
Pleasure.
All enjoyed it.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I apologize. I saw later on that there was some waiting to get in that I didn't have the wherewithal with the shared screen. I am new to Zoom and figuring that out as I go. So I apologize for those who didn't get admitted until.
Few technical problems are to be expected.
Yeah. Excellent. If anybody else has any other questions, I'm happy to stay for a couple of minutes. So I'll be the last to sign out of the room.
John, here's a quick question. The state of archaeology today, where would you say is the #1 site, dig, etc., where archaeologists are finding what they're looking for, whatever that may be, or finding antiquities, and what are they finding today?
I would say there are two really significant ones in the ancient Near East. In Jerusalem, the city of David is an incredibly complex site because it's beyond the Green Line and it's in an Arab neighborhood that is part of East Jerusalem. That's from modern politics, Palestinians believe should be part of a future capital of a Palestinian state. And it's also the oldest part of Jerusalem, and it is incredibly rich with finds. So it is stunning how many of the big names in the Israeli archaeological fields are excavating different areas there. And now to go back to Kathleen Kenyon, who was very, very meticulous and scientific, and she also believed that we don't know everything in our day. So she would cut a 1-meter trench along an artifact so that there would be a lot of earth that was still intact for future archaeologists to go back. What they're doing in the city of David is they've made it a huge archaeological park, and they're clearing out everything And they're going back to 2,000 years ago. So this is something that archaeologists have to decide where to stop digging. Do you keep going all the way to bedrock? Do you, like, at what point, because archaeologists, as they're digging down, they are destroying things that have been preserved intact for thousands of years. And so that also is like a very significant political decision of where you want to go to and what you want to expose. And how you're going to leave it for, you know, the general public, for the layperson to come and see later on. So it is a endlessly fascinating site. They're always working on it. They tried to build a visitor center in 3 different locations. They keep having to move it because, I mean, where King David's palace might be was going to be where the visitor center was. And then they buy this massive palace that could be King David's, which is mind-blowing. And so they have to move it over and find a new site. And then in Egypt, something that's really interesting is that they are using satellite photography to identify new sites that the average person looking around wouldn't be able to see. And they're identifying hundreds of new tombs. And in Egypt, if you find, you know, one pharaoh over the course of 3,000 years whose tomb is intact, then you could have another king type situation.
Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you so much. I really, it's such a treat for me to do this with Hazak and with TBS. Just going through to see. I think I saw a hand.
It's in a Greg Bannett.
Who was it? Greg? Okay. Okay. Well, excellent. Well, thank you so much, everyone. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks,
John.
John, good to see you.
Work.
Excellent.
Thanks, John.
Thank you, John.
Thank you. Very
Thank
interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you, everyone.
Excellent. Okay.
Kudos.
I'm going to click end meeting.
Okay.
Here, everyone.
He's ending the meeting.
Oh, okay.
Oh, were you going to ask a question? If there's a question, I'm happy to wait.
Only. Okay, we can kick out.